Certainly one of the most romantic episodes in all of history is the Crusades. In fact, the legacy of the Crusades still with us today, as the Muslim fundamentalists are quite unhappy that maybe we're engaged in some next crusade. Well, the Crusades, as they actually happened in the High Middle Ages, there were probably 7 or maybe even 9 of these armies that marched off to the Middle East, ostensibly to redeem the Holy Land for the Christians. Scholars put a lot of other motivation behind what Pope Urban II and Richard the Lionheart and King Louis VII of France and others who stimulated these crusades, other than just religious fervor. But one thing we know from our perspective in this course is that the effect of disease, both in terms of the course of the Crusades and in terms of how the Crusades affected disease, rather profound. For example, of the tens of thousands of men who left Europe for the Middle East to redeem the Holy Land, capture Jerusalem, etc., only a handful came home, literally a handful. King Louis VII in what's often called the Second Crusade, although the numbers we put on these crusades aren't very significant, estimated 500,000 men sent to the Holy Land. Only a few thousand returned. And the vast majority of these men weren't killed by Muslims or the Saracens or whatever they chose to call them in those days, but killed by disease. And sometimes not just diseases that struck the men. In one case, Knights of the Crusades in a siege of Antioch lost 5,000 of their 7,000 horses to some disease. Leave to Dr. Oberg a speculation as to what that disease might have been that killed all those horses. But here you had these heavily armored knights deprived of their horses, so they became easy pickings for the Muslims. Well, finally, in the 1290s, the Crusades literally petered out, and there was an abandonment of this very strange attempt that had gone on for a couple, 300 years by Europeans to capture the Holy Land away from the Muslims. But in the meantime, profound effects going both ways. Sometimes we think that the Crusades, unlike the Columbian Exchange that happened with the conquest of America by Europeans, was only a one-way thing, but it really wasn't. Although, for example, leprosy traveled back into Europe with these Crusaders as they came back. Scholars try to understand why the Crusades were such a failure. There are all kinds of ways to examine that question. One thing, though, that we do know for certain is that the Muslims, their traditions, their smaller, better trained armies, cleaner, simply fared better in the kind of warfare that took place during the Crusades. And there's this one last anecdote that's kind of interesting. One of the great killers of the Crusaders was dysentery. And scholars have pointed out that when you have dysentery, what you need is liquid. You need it badly because you're losing enormous amounts of fluids. The Middle East, dry, desert place, the waters that they're able to consume, not very salubrious. If the fighting had been in Europe, very few of the Crusaders might have died from dysentery because of the prevalence of beer. Beer would have saved them by the thousands, because not only does the beer rehydrate you, but also contains nutrients, salts, other things that help a person be healthy. So this dramatic event, the Crusades, stimulated literature, stimulated a great deal of change in Europe, but the disease factor, enormous. And I don't think historians have quite yet begun to understand how enormous it really was.